Okay, so I got the recording started, so now I can share my screen. Okay. Can I get a
Yes, sir.
verbal on my screen for the second time?
Yes, sir. Now we are seeing most of the screen is just a background. White box. There you go. Perfect.
All right. We'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody who's able to attend today. As always, I'm recording the session for those folks who couldn't attend live and can view it after the fact. We are continuing and concluding our series of trainings on understanding ISO 13485. Today, we're going to be reviewing Section 8. Section 8 is one of the areas of the ISO standard where there is a little bit of debate or interpretation about what some of these clauses actually require. So we are going to focus in on a couple of areas that in an audit can become a little bit difficult to navigate depending on how your individual quality management system is set up to handle some of these sections. So we're going to start off with the general clauses. As always, we're focusing in on the shalls as they pertain to the regulation. So in 8.1, the organization shall plan and implement the monitoring, measurement, analysis, and improvement processes. And you're doing that so that you can demonstrate conformity of the product, so that you can show that your quality management system is suitable and effective. And we're going to see some of that language repeated multiple times in the rest of Section 8, and that you can maintain the effectiveness of the quality management system. Now, if you'll remember, the ability to meet customer requirements, which ties into conformity of product, goes all the way back to the introduction where we talk about the purpose of the quality management system in general. So we're linking back to our purpose here and all the way at the end in Section 8. And then the effectiveness of the quality management system ties back into sections 4 and 5 when we talk about management commitment to the quality management system. So this includes a determination of the methods, including the statistical techniques that you're going to use to monitor these three things that we've outlined in A, B, and C. So if you're going to have a plan and you're going to have a process that you use to do these things, and it's generally captured in a procedure of some kind, sometimes that procedure is explicitly called out as statistical techniques. There's another section that we're going to talk about here in a moment that talks about analysis of data. Oftentimes, those two procedures are combined together, and the procedure will either be called statistical techniques or it will be called analysis of data. And that's what we use to document the process and procedures around this element of Section 8. So we're going to move into 8.2. Now that we've established the requirement to monitor and measure the quality management system, and we're going to look at 8.2.1, which is titled feedback. Now, frequently, when we talk about feedback in the organization, we talk about it primarily in the context of complaints. But I would call your attention to the fact that complaint handling is actually section 8.2.2 down at the bottom of my screen. And there is an element of feedback that is intended to be part of your quality management system that is a little bit more than just capturing complaint data from the field. And what you're attempting to capture there is, have you met the customer requirements, which again goes all the way back to the purpose of your quality management system, and that's highlighted here, whether or not you have met the customer requirements. And then it talks a little bit about having a procedure to capture this feedback, keeping records of the feedback, but also that this feedback should loop back into your risk management system. Let me see if I can point to that real quick here on my screen. Serves as input into your risk management system. Now, it's very clear why complaint handling would feed back into your risk management system, because you're talking about actual failure modes of the product, and it's a little bit more straightforward of how risk management would feed back into your quality management system. But I think that from a risk management perspective, when it talks about feedback, again, remember that part of the purpose of the ISO standard is to serve the OEMs as well as the contract manufacturers, right? And so as I look at this feedback section, one of the ways that I would apply this if I were an OEM is that I might get a lot of feedback from hospitals or surgeons about the performance of the device that is not necessarily a complaint, but might address user needs. It might address some things that they would like to see in terms of improvements. And that type of feedback can feed back into your risk management system, but it also feeds back into your design control system because it might become part of that iterative loop where you are constantly reevaluating design input requirements. So just know that there is a section of the ISO standard that talks about feedback that is not specifically pertaining to complaints. And you should have an idea of how your site is capturing some of that feedback. So for example, on the design side of the business, one of the ways that we capture feedback is we go out to our customers and we talk to them about how we are doing in terms of product development. And that product development can mean a lot of different things. It can mean timelines, it can mean budget, it can mean communication, collaboration with our customers. So there are a lot of different things that you can classify as feedback that could feed into your quality system, but would not necessarily be a complaint. As we move down and talk specifically about complaint handling, focusing on the shalls, the organization shall document procedures for complaint handling, and those procedures should be in accordance with the applicable regulatory standards. Again, going back to the purpose of your quality management system, ensure that you meet customer specifications and that you meet regulatory requirements. So we're constantly referring back to the purpose of the quality system. And these procedures at a minimum have to include the following. You have to include how you are receiving and recording complaint information. So frequently you have some kind of an intake process for how you document the information that you received when a customer, or in some cases where a doctor or a facility are communicating about the complaint to your organization. You have to evaluate the information to determine if it's actually a complaint or maybe just feedback. You have to investigate the complaint. You have to understand what the reporting requirements are. And we'll talk a little bit more about reporting requirements in just a moment. How you handle the product. So for example, if you are receiving a complaint unit back from the field, then you have to understand if there are bloodborne pathogen concerns, if the device has been used. And so there's some special handling and cleaning requirements that need to be done before you can do the investigation. So there are some handling of complaint-related product procedures and processes that need to be in place. And then after you've done all of that work and the investigation, you determine whether or not you need to initiate any corrective or corrections or corrective actions. So a couple of things to kind of talk about here. Number one, I want to point out the fact that it explicitly says here in the standard that you need to determine if there is a need for corrections or corrective actions, implying that there may not be a need to do those things. And there are ways that you can use your risk management system to identify whether or not there are corrective or corrections or corrective actions that need to take place. It's a little bit outside the scope of this conversation, but it is something that if you have questions about how you would use your risk management system to make that determination, let me know and we can have that conversation. I will say that if you make the election not to investigate a complaint, it says here, if any complaint is not investigated, then justification shall be documented. Let me just caution all of you that justification needs to be very solid. If you make a decision not to investigate a complaint, there needs to be some very sound rationale around why you did not do that investigation. And it shouldn't include things like didn't have the resources or it was just a single complaint, especially if the severity of the complaint is very high. If there was an adverse event associated with the complaint, you would be hard pressed to put together a justification for why that complaint should not be investigated. And then there's also language here that says that if the investigation determines that the result of the complaint or the cause of the complaint was something that took place outside of your organization, then you need to communicate that to the appropriate party. So that line there is a big part of why our OEM partners send complaints to us if they feel that the complaint was manufacturing related, but they may not send complaints to us if they find that the complaint was design related, which we don't have any influence over. And then obviously we have our normal keep records of your complaint investigations. I'm going to move forward to 8.2.3 and talk briefly about reporting to regulatory authorities, because you'll see that up here in 8.2.2 section D, where it talks about determining the need to report the information. So as a contract manufacturer, virtually all of our quality agreements pretty explicitly state that the responsibility for reporting to regulatory authorities lies solely with our OEM customers, largely because of a couple of factors. Number one, there's typically a clinical evaluation that needs to take place in order to determine if an adverse event occurred and whether or not you have to file, depending on the geography that you're filing the complaint in. It might be an MDR report is what it's called in the FDA jurisdiction, an adverse event report, or they have other terminology for different geographies outside the US. And there are timelines associated with that reporting as well, depending on the severity of the complaint. So certain complaints, you have 30 days to do your investigation and file your report to the regulatory agencies. And in certain cases where it's a high severity or severe adverse event, you only have 5 days to submit your initial report associated with that complaint. Now, again, our quality agreements outline that our customers are responsible for filing those reports. But whenever our customers are applying a significant amount of pressure to us to complete our complaint investigations in a timely fashion, a lot of times it's because they are trying to satisfy those timeline requirements for significant adverse events and complaint reporting. If your organization is responsible for complaint and adverse event reporting for some reason, then you need to have procedures that very clearly outline all of the different requirements for each geographic territory and regulatory agency that you interact with, because the timelines and the requirements for how you submit those reports, they vary from location to location, so you would need procedures specifically for that. Okay, section 8.2.4 talks about internal audits. So the organization you shall conduct internal audits at planned intervals. Now notice the language here, conduct the audits at planned intervals does not designate what that interval should be. But I will tell you that if you are doing if your internal audit procedure says that you are going to audit your entire quality management system every 2 years or every 3 years, you are likely going to get an audit finding for that. Even though the standard does not explicitly say it has to be at least annually, the general expectation is that you are performing an internal audit of your entire quality management system on at least an annual basis. Now, you don't have to do it quarterly and you don't have to do it monthly, but be prepared that you might get some severe pushback and or an audit finding if you're not doing these audits at least annually. The purpose of the internal audits is to show that your quality management system conforms to the planned and documented arrangements and requirements of the standard and the regulatory requirements. So however you have constructed your quality management system in terms of the procedures that you've put together in order to demonstrate compliance to the ISO standard 1345 and the applicable regulatory requirements, you have to be able to demonstrate conformity to all of those procedures, and then by extension, the standard and the regulatory requirements. That's the purpose of your audit program. And you have to be able to demonstrate that your quality management system has been effectively implemented and maintained. And the way you do that is, by the types of audit findings that you get in your internal audit program. Now, I will say this is a little bit outside the scope of the ISO training that we're doing, but I would just say that philosophically or conceptually, what you want your internal audit program to do is to identify issues internally before it gets identified by a notified body or the FDA. If your internal audit program routinely and year after year comes back and reports 0 findings of any kind, unless you have an incredibly mature quality system that's been pressure tested for multiple years, and you have a very high degree of confidence that on a day-to-day basis, all of your procedures are executed perfectly, then the fact that you're getting 0 findings year after year in your internal audit program should be a little bit of a red flag for you, that maybe you're not diving deep enough into your systems as part of your internal audit program. So the rest of the language here states that your organization is going to have an internal audit procedure, that in addition to that, you're going to have an audit plan. And the purpose of the audit plan is to provide a schedule that shows an auditor how you will accomplish or did accomplish a full quality management system audit over the course of that year. So it will outline what sections you audited and when those audits took place, or when they are scheduled to take place in the future. The auditors have to be impartial. You can't audit your own work. And frequently, if the operations group is being audited, then you cannot be a member of the operations team performing that audit. If you are, you have to be auditing a separate area of operations that you don't have any influence, authority, or responsibility towards. And understandably so, you want your internal audits to be impartial, so that if there are things that need to be escalated as audit findings, there's no hesitancy or reluctance to issue those findings. Your obligatory keep records of your internal audit statements are included here, and then implement any necessary corrective actions. So if you do identify findings and they do represent areas of your quality management system that need corrective actions, then you'll implement those and you will record those accordingly. Any questions on 8.2.1 through 8.2.4 before I move forward? Because as we get into the rest of this, with the conversation goes pretty quickly. So I want to pause and see if anybody has any questions.
I have a question, Brian, about the auditing your own work and the internal audit process. And what do you do if it's unavoidable? What if you have an extremely small team and you're kind of overlapping duties and it's just unavoidable?
So there are a few things that I would say you should consider as options. And here's a really good one. The internal audit program itself is supposed to be subject to an internal audit. So as a member of the internal auditing team, how do you impartially audit the internal audit process, right? So there are a couple of things that you can do that are, I will say some are specific to being part of the Viant organization and some that are not. If you have an incredibly small organization, you can always reach out to one of the other Viant facilities and ask for some assistance in performing some of those audits, especially if it's a very limited scope, where you're reaching out to another facility and saying, hey, I've done all the other internal audits, but I can't audit these 1, 2, or 3 sections because we don't have any other auditors and I can't audit my own work. Can you help me out? We do that from time to time. You can contract it out to an external resource, right? The other thing I would say is if it's just absolutely unavoidable and you have to audit your own work, then I would do a couple of things probably. Number one, I would be incredibly hard on that section that I was auditing, especially if I'm auditing my own work. I'm going to really look for opportunities to issue findings to demonstrate that I was being impartial and identifying areas where there were opportunities. And then maybe I would do something like, even though there might be somebody else in the organization who's not technically trained as an internal auditor, I might ask them to witness all or sections of the audit, observe me do the audit, just to demonstrate that the work did actually take place and that it was done in as close to an impartial manner as possible. And then if you wanted to go the extra step of having them sign the audit report strictly as a witness, but not necessarily as an auditor, you could do something like that. That third option, you're going to have to kind of talk your way through in an audit because they're not going to like it. But sometimes, to your point, it is kind of unavoidable. Did I answer your question, Scott?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Just kind of to put a pin in that comment that I stated, you are required to audit your internal audit process. I have seen sites get audit findings in their ISO audits simply because they forgot to audit the audit process itself. So just keep that in mind as you're developing your audit plan and executing that system over the course of the year. Okay. So we're going to talk about 8.2.5 and 8.2.6, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit in tandem. and we've seen this in other areas of the ISO standard where you see some very small clauses, very simple language that kind of understates the complexity and broad scope of what it is that they're asking you to do. So as we talk about monitoring processes, this can mean a couple of different things. The organization shall apply suitable methods for monitoring and, as appropriate, measurement of the quality management system processes. So this is specifically talking about management system processes. We're not talking about manufacturing processes. These methods demonstrate the ability of the processes to achieve the planned results, and when they're not achieved, you implement corrective actions. So this is stating that there is a requirement that you will monitor your quality system processes. Now, frequently we do this in management review is one of the areas where we monitor our quality system processes pretty specifically. But depending on your site, management review might only be happening once a year or once every 6 months. And so I encourage you to find other ways to monitor the performance of your quality management system processes and formally document that monitoring. So for example, if you have a CAPA review board meeting once a month where you review the CAPA system specifically, then make sure that the scope of that CAPA review board meeting is not just a report out of whether or not your CAPAs are on time, but that it evaluates the overall CAPA process in total, not necessarily every month, but maybe every 3 months or something like that, and include that in the agenda and capture that in formal meeting minutes that come out of that CAPA review board process so that you can show that more than just on an annual basis when you do management review, you're evaluating the effectiveness of your CAPA program. So that would be an example of how you might do that outside the scope of management review. Some sites have a monthly quality data review that captures multiple quality systems. That is a little bit different agenda than their management review, and they do it monthly. That's another opportunity where you could try and capture a lot of your quality management system and demonstrate that it's being effective over the course of the year. When it comes to product, here we're stating that the organization shall monitor product. Again, going back to the purpose of your quality management system, ensure that you're meeting customer specifications. And the way that you do that is you monitor the product specifically to verify that the requirements have been met. So this needs to be carried out at the applicable stages of the manufacturing process. So for example, if one of your requirements is a visual inspection of a component, and after you put the entire assembly together, you can't even see that component because it's buried down inside the assembly, then the final packaging and sterile lot release is not the appropriate place for you to be attempting to do that inspection. You should be doing it at the point in the manufacturing process where it's most relevant for you to perform that inspection. So when they talk about applicable stages of product realization process, that's what they're talking about. You want to put the inspection closest to the point of manufacturing that you can, where it is relevant and applicable for you to perform that inspection. You have to maintain evidence of conformity. So when you perform inspections, you document those inspections, you document who did the inspections, and you keep all of those records. Now, again, very simply stated in just a couple of paragraphs, but all of you are fully aware of the extent to which we have implemented inspection programs across our entire organization. It is a significant undertaking that is encapsulated in just a few sentences here in the standard, but very critical to the overall ability to demonstrate the conformity of the product. It says here that for implantable medical devices, the organization shall record the identity of personnel performing the inspection. I will tell you that it's just general best practice to record who performed the inspection, whether it's an implantable medical device or not. Okay, we're going to move into section 8.3, which is control of non-conforming product. In the general section, in summary, what it says there is that the organization shall ensure that the product that is non-conforming is identified and controlled to prevent delivery. The entire purpose of the non-conforming materials procedure and process is to identify and control product that has been determined to be non-conforming to try and prevent it from reaching the end user. Now, in our case, that means that maybe we identified it internally. Maybe we identified it and we ask our customer to try and contain it. Maybe we identify it and a distribution center somewhere is trying to contain it. Maybe it's product that is already out in the field. Containment may include some kind of a field action. Now, field action can mean multiple things. The language here specifically is that you're trying to prevent its unintended use or delivery. Think about that in the context of delivery can mean a lot of things. It can mean to our customer, it can mean to a DC, it could mean delivery to a hospital. The final link in the chain is delivery to the patient. So you still have an obligation to try and prevent delivery to the patient. And that's where field actions come into play. Now, field actions can mean a couple of different things. You can, and it depends a little bit on what the nonconformance is specifically. But a field action could mean something where you issue an advisory notice to the field and you say, hey, if you, we found out that if you take the device out of the box and you press the red button before you turn it on for the first time, then the unit won't function. So please don't press the red button, right? So an advisory notice asks or makes the people in the field aware of a certain issue associated with the product, that the product will still potentially function as it's intended and there's no safety or efficacy concerns, but you're just making them aware that there are certain things that they should or should not do. Sometimes there are field notices where you are asking them to not use the product and destroy it. You don't want them to ship it back to you. You just want them to destroy the product and not use it, and you communicate that you're going to replace that product. And then the one that you've heard of and we talk about most commonly is a recall, where you are providing notification to the field that you need them to send the product back to you. All of those, and then there are even others that you can do. There are technically ways to do field reworks, although they're not very common. All of those things can fall under the category of advisory notice, and all of those are in an effort to prevent non-conforming product from that final stage of delivery where they are delivered to the patient. Now, in our world, contextually, delivery typically means delivery to our customer or to the customer's distribution center. And so our non-conforming procedures are primarily geared to try and identify issues internally, identify non-conforming product internally, and prevent it from leaving our facility. So your procedure associated with non-conformances should capture the following elements, and I'll see if I can highlight them here pretty quickly. Identification, segregation, evaluation, and disposition. And here's where some sites kind of the site's procedures, and depending on the specific auditor or inspector that you get, this is where things get a little bit complicated, because I want to call to your attention the fact that corrective action is not listed as one of the requirements of your procedure for nonconformance. The purpose of nonconformance procedures and programs is to identify nonconforming product, document the nonconforming product and the scope of everything that's affected, segregate it, meaning prevent delivery, evaluate that product, and then disposition it. Disposition it meaning use as is, meaning scrapping the product, reworking the product, but it does not require that you implement corrective actions. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about that, because that doesn't mean you don't have to do corrective actions, but it does mean that there are some additional language that you need to look at in determining how you're going to implement corrective actions. And I will also caution you that this is not a get out of jail free card. The reason why most sites build some element of correction or corrective action into their non-conforming materials procedure is because if you're not going to do any kind of corrective action, you have to have a very good justification and risk-based rationale as to why you're not going to do it. And historically, lots of sites have not been very good at writing those justifications and rationales. And so what would happen is they would go into an audit or an inspection and they would get a finding that said you didn't do an investigation and you didn't have a sufficient rationale or explanation for why, I'm sorry, not an investigation. You didn't do a corrective action and you didn't have a sufficient justification or rationale as to why you didn't do one. And so they got an audit finding for it. And the way that they responded to the audit finding was by saying, okay, well then from now on, we're just going to put corrective actions into our procedure that we do it all the time, as opposed to getting better at risk management based rationales and justifications within the context of your non-conforming materials procedure. Now, for your organization, that might make sense. It might be that the best way to handle that potential compliance gap is to just mandate that you always do some kind of corrective action. But I just want you to understand that the regulation itself does not require that here in this specific section, but we are going to talk about what it does say in a couple of the sections coming up. This is one of those areas where I don't want anybody walking away from this saying, Brian Curry says we don't have to do corrective actions as part of our nonconformance system. What I'm saying is it's not required, but you do have to explain and justify if you're not going to do it. The next thing it says here is that the evaluation of the nonconformity shall include a determination of the need for an investigation. So again, just in the same way where it says, it doesn't say that you're required to do a corrective action, it also states that you're not required to do an investigation into the root cause of the nonconformity. But I think it's a little bit misleading in the language they have here in the standard, because that presupposes that you have a robust risk management system that you can lean on to make this determination. So I'm gonna take off my highlight here and zero in on just this word, determination. And it's going to fight me on it, but how you make that determination is critical in terms of whether or not you get a finding or an observation for not performing an investigation related to a nonconformance. And if you don't have concrete confidence in your ability to make effective determinations in why you do or do not investigate the root cause of nonconformances, then what most sites do is they just investigate all of them. But understand that there is some leniency there if you can use your risk management system to make some educated and evidence data-based determinations as to why one is not required. Okay, and then records, right? We keep records. We do it all the time. At this point, you shouldn't be surprised that the last sentence in every one of these sections is keep records. But if you do keep records of the nonconformances and then you decide that you're going to do any subsequent actions, including evaluation and investigation, then you include the actions that you did for your investigation and your actions. And if you don't do them, then you include the rationale for the decisions that you made. That rationale goes back to that determination word, right? The determination for not doing an investigation and the rationale for why you're not doing corrective actions. Any questions about that? That's an area that can get you into a lot of trouble in an audit or an inspection if you don't fully understand what the requirement is, and even better, how your site specifically does or does not satisfy that requirement. So any questions before I move on? Okay. Actions in response to non-conforming product that is detected before delivery. So the organization deals with non-conforming product in one of a few ways. A, taking action to eliminate the detected nonconformity. Now, in my interpretation of the standard, this is not the same thing as a corrective action. This is more about disposition. The way that I interpret this language is to mean that if you have identified nonconforming product, you eliminate that nonconformity by potentially reworking the product, by scrapping the product, or some other method to eliminate the nonconformity before it is delivered to the end user. That's not the same thing as a corrective action. A corrective action is intended to eliminate the root cause of a nonconformity, not the nonconformity itself. The other thing that you have to do in response to nonconforming product is take action to preclude its original intended use or application. So if you can't eliminate the nonconformity, then you have to preclude its original intended use or application. Scrap is one way that we do that, okay? A field action might be another way that you do that. Or you can authorize its use and release or accept it under concession. This is the use as is disposition for your nonconformance system. So I'm going to go back to the first sentence and highlight that it says that your actions in response to nonconforming product is by one or more of the following ways. Not all of these, it could be all of them, but is one or more of the following. So you might disposition it use as is, And option C here might be how you respond to the nonconformance. You might do I don't even know how I did that there. Okay, you might do eliminate the nonconformity by doing a rework. And maybe there's product that is already out in the field. So you're going to do rework of the product you have in house, but you're also going to take action to preclude its original use or delivery to the end user by doing some kind of field action. So there are multiple opportunities to use these three clauses to act in response to non-conforming product. If you've detected it after delivery, this is kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, then you shall take the appropriate action essentially to notify people of the nonconformance. You have to notify to all the relevant organizations, and you have to keep records of the action that's taken. At a minimum, you have to be able to demonstrate through records that you did the appropriate advisory notices. But in the case of the FDA specifically, and in almost all cases from a geographical standpoint, if you're going to do a recall, you can't just send a recall notification to all the hospitals and doctors' offices and ask them to send you back the product. You also have to notify the FDA specifically that you are issuing a recall or some kind of field advisory. And typically what they like to see is not only records of your attempt to communicate with all of those hospitals and other organizations about the nonconformance, and they want to see multiple attempts in various forms and fashions to make that communication, but they also want to see a reconciliation. So if your nonconformance says the scope of nonconforming product is 1,000 units, they want to see records that reconcile those 1,000 units. Either a hospital reaches out to you and says, hey, we saw that we had 5 of them, excuse me, and we're not going to send them back to you, but we're going to toss them out. Then you record and reconcile those 5 units. And ultimately, what they want to see is a full reconciliation of all 1,000. That's not always possible, but they want to see a very deliberate and concerted effort to try and reconcile to that extent. Okay, and then there is a specific section under the nonconformance clause around rework. And it talks about how when you perform rework, you should do it in accordance with documented procedures for how you do rework, and that you have to take into account the potential negative impacts or effects of the rework steps themselves on the intended performance of the product. So if your rework introduces other risks or causes the device to become non-conforming in some other fashion, you have to capture that and provide it as part of your assessment and rationale as to why the rework instructions are okay, and it is still worth reworking the product. The people that review and approve the rework instructions should be the same cross-functional group of people that approved the original procedure or process or work instructions that the product is non-conforming to. You can't just have one individual draft up some rework instructions and release them without peer review from other cross-functional areas. Okay, we're going to be stepping out of non-conformances into analysis of data. So is there any questions about the non-conforming clause in the regulation before I move on?
So Brian, this is Michelle. So real quick, under section 8.3.3, when we talk about non-conforming product that was identified after delivery. So you spoke a lot about product that if we own it, we've taken on the responsibility for an assessment, whether or not we needed a recall, field action, those types of things. But we also, as contract manufacturers, have the responsibility to notify our customers if we have shipped non-conforming products. So every site should still have a procedure in place to capture the release of non-conforming product, whether it is, you know, a notification, a formal notification to said customer, here's the scope. So that way our customer can then do their due diligence for if they've already released it. For instance, we had a situation years ago where we had product that we identified the gauge was wrong and it went back years. years. Yeah. So for, 5 years worth of product that was manufactured, we needed to pull that all into scope. So it was pretty massive product. So just kind of throwing that out there for all the folks on this team.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michelle. That's a very good point. Remember everyone that the purpose of the non-conforming process is to prevent delivery, right? And delivery can mean a lot of different things, and it doesn't just mean delivery to the field. It can mean delivery to our customers and really every link in that supply chain. All right, analysis of data. So the organization shall have procedures to determine, collect, and analyze data in order to demonstrate suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system. And I'm going to try and find that real quick here and highlight it for you because you're going to see this language over and over again. Here it is, suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system. Now, if you attend management review at your facility, you likely have a slide in your management review slide deck, or at a minimum, an agenda item or something that comes out in the minutes, or a question that gets asked at the end of management review that says, does the data demonstrate that our quality management system is suitable, adequate, and effective? And that is because of this explicit requirement in the ISO standard that you have to be looking at the data coming out of your quality management system to determine, is your quality management system functioning effectively? This includes statistical techniques, and it also includes a couple of areas at a minimum that they expect you to evaluate in order to determine if your quality management system is effective. So let's talk a little bit about that and think about, okay, what would it look like if our quality management system was not effective, if it was not working? Well, let's go back to the purpose of the quality management system. The purpose of the quality management system is to ensure that you can meet customer specifications and that you can meet regulatory requirements. So if your quality management system was not effective, then you're probably not doing those two things. You're not meeting customer specifications and you're not meeting regulatory requirements. So when they talk about the data that they want you to look at, feedback, customer feedback, okay. If we were getting a lot of customer feedback that said that product was not meeting specifications, then our quality management system is not effective because it's not meeting that fundamental purpose. If we were getting a bunch of conformity issues, a lot of non-conforming product, and so there was a lot, our data showed that there were a lot of non-conformances. We're not meeting customer specifications, our quality system's not effective because that's one of the fundamental purposes. If we evaluate characteristics and trends of the processes and the product, looking for opportunities for improvement, that drives back to product conformity. We look at our suppliers. Suppliers are an extension of customer specifications. If our suppliers are not providing product that meets our components that meet specifications, then we're not meeting customer specifications. Audits would be the regulatory piece. If all of our audit data shows that we have a lot of compliance issues as it pertains to our procedures outlining and meeting the requirements of the various regulatory agencies, then our quality management system is not effective because we're not meeting one of the two fundamental purposes of the quality management system. So this is not the maximum amount or the total of the systems that you should be looking at in order to determine if your quality system is effective. But at a minimum, you should be looking at these areas. And if you have problems in some or all of these areas, then you should be taking a step back to evaluate, does the data indicate that we have some real fundamental and underlying issues where our quality system is just not working? If you do make that determination, and I would not make that determination lightly, because establishing that your quality system is not effective is a pretty serious accusation to level at your quality system. So I would expect you to have a preponderance of data to support that claim. But if you did decide to make that claim, then essentially what this says is that you have to document that decision and any data that you use to make that decision, and then they want to see you document the corrections that you put in place. Essentially, they say, use it as an input for improvement, but that kind of feeds into, well, it feeds into the next clause 8.5. And what you're going to see there is that you ultimately treat it as a corrective action. You take all of this data and say our quality system is not effective, and we've got to make some corrective actions in order to improve our quality system so that it is effective. So let's move into 8.5 and talk about that. So organizations shall ensure the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system, as well as medical device safety and performance through the use of a lot of things that ultimately represent the sum total of your quality management system. So it says, here's how you use your improvement system. And the improvement system captures both corrective and preventive action. Number one, you're going to use this improvement system to actually improve the quality management system itself. Whether you're improving it because you determined in the previous clause that it is fundamentally not effective, well, then here's the system that you're going to use to fix it. Or maybe you just have some smaller elements that are not effective. Maybe you, in your internal audits, you identified a compliance gap. Well, this is the system for improvement that you can use to document the closure of that compliance gap. Or maybe you found a product conformity issue in your non-conforming materials process, and you can use this improvement section to drive improvements and eliminate that customer specification gap associated with your quality system. So it is a very broad umbrella that we are casting here to capture not only the quality management system, but also, let me see if I can highlight it here, the medical device safety and performance, which ties back to product conformity, which ties back to meeting customer specifications. So what makes up the improvement process? There are two major elements that make up the improvement process: corrective action and preventive action. This is another section where I'm going to talk about them in tandem, because essentially the requirements for corrective action and preventive action are identical, with one exception, and I'll highlight it here. The only difference is in corrective action, it says that you're going to evaluate the need for action in order to make sure that the nonconformity does not recur. And here in preventive action, it says that you are evaluating the need for action to prevent occurrence. All the rest of the language is virtually identical. It's just making that distinction between why you would call one corrective and why you would call one preventive. So your procedures for improvement, or your procedures for corrective and preventive action, shall be structured in a way that you are taking action to eliminate the cause of nonconformities. Now, those nonconformities could be nonconformities in product. It could be nonconformities in your actual quality management system. And the intention is that you prevent recurrence. Now, this is an area that is also a little bit open to interpretation, this concept of prevent recurrence. And I would say that frequently in the execution of your corrective and preventive action program, there are going to be times when you identify a failure mode of some kind, and this is more along the lines of product nonconformity than it is system nonconformity. There are going to be times when, through the course of your investigation, implementation of corrective actions, and verification of effectiveness, you are going to find that you cannot fully prevent 100% recurrence of the nonconformance. Let me say that in a little bit more of a clear way. You can't fully eliminate the failure mode. You can improve the occurrence rate, but you cannot completely eliminate the occurrence rate or drive it to zero. And there are methods and ways that you can close a corrective action even though you have not fully eliminated the failure mode. If you're, and I'll make up an example, but if you're doing an investigation into a nonconformance or a complaint, and your actual occurrence rate, meaning the quantifiable, measurable occurrence rate that you are seeing, is 20% failure, and through your investigation and your implementation of corrective actions, you are able to reduce that occurrence rate from 20% down to 3%. Significant improvement. And such significant improvement that 3% is in line with or better than your risk management documentation in what was considered an allowable occurrence rate for that particular failure mode. But as an organization, you know that in order to make that 3% 0%, the amount of investment of resources and effort that would be needed in order to make that last 3% incremental improvement is not practical or feasible. You can still close your corrective action, and identify that your corrective action is being closed based on a reduction in the failure mode, but not an elimination of the failure mode. And you can still make the argument that you prevented a significant amount of recurrence and that the remaining probability of recurrence is in line with your risk management documentation and is considered acceptable by the design. Now, ultimately, the customer, in our circumstance, the customer is largely going to be the one that makes the determination that any residual occurrence rate is acceptable. But just know that that is a defensible position within your corrective action program. Okay. The procedure for improvement, or the procedure for corrective and preventive action, defines the requirements for the following. You have to review nonconformities, including complaints, to analyze that data. Remember, 8.4 was analyzing data in order to determine the need for improvement. You're going to analyze nonconformances and complaints to determine if there is a trend or based on either occurrence or severity that dictates that you need to take some kind of improvement or corrective action. You're going to determine the cause of that nonconformity. You're going to evaluate the need for action to ensure that it does not recur. That is the sentence that becomes your corrective action. You're going to plan and document the actions that are needed and how you're going to implement them. And then you're going to verify that the corrective action does not adversely affect the ability to meet applicable regulatory requirements and the safety and performance of the medical device. And this is something, if I remember correctly, that was recently added in the most recent version of the ISO 13485 standard. And it is something that frequently you can get an audit finding for, which is you might have the best of intentions in implementing corrective actions to improve a process or improve product conformity. But if you don't evaluate what the potential ramifications are or the ripple effects of those corrective actions are, both to product conformity and to regulatory requirements, you can still get an audit finding for your corrective action and preventive action program because you didn't appropriately implement and verify the corrective actions that you implemented. So this verification step here is not verification of the effectiveness of the corrective actions. It's the verification of the impact of the corrective actions that you plan to implement or have implemented. And then this section here is the traditional verification of effectiveness of the corrective actions in terms of whether or not they ultimately impact the occurrence rate of the nonconformity that you're trying to prevent. And then, of course, we maintain records. Any questions about any of that related to corrective and preventive actions?
Hi, Brian. This is Gopi here. I have a question on this. How do you document this when you're working on a CAPA and you are, or how do you document is the second question. First question is, how do you perform this assessment for the regulatory requirement or the safety and efficacy of the product has not been affected due to the corrective actions you made to your CAPA? I can give you, I mean, if you need, there is an example that one of the CAPA I'm working. So there is some oxides present on the coils, which are the implantable device. So how do you document, I mean, how do you document it to verify that you don't miss out this point?
Okay, so one of the first things that I would encourage you to do as you're trying to evaluate whether or not you've impacted the, let's start with conformity of the device, right? Let me look at the specific language that it uses. Ability to meet safety and performance of the medical device, okay? So I would first lean on your design requirements. Go back, and you're probably in many cases, maybe not so much for you, Gopi, you're in a little bit of a unique situation, but for most of our sites, you're gonna have to lean on the customer for this. But go back to your design input requirements, your design output requirements, and see if the changes that you're implementing are going to adversely impact your ability to meet your design input requirements. See if the changes that you're implementing affect any kind of validated state. You might have used some validation work to verify some of your design inputs as part of your design output process. and maybe something that you're changing changes a parameter on a piece of equipment or some other area that would affect the validated state, then you need to go back. That would be a trigger for a revalidation, right? A revalidation would be one way that you would demonstrate or justify that the changes that you've implemented do not affect the safety and performance of the medical device, because we can still demonstrate that we meet all of the design requirements that we were trying to achieve. You also want to evaluate whether or not the corrective actions that you've implemented might inadvertently generate a new failure mode that you had never seen before, because you've changed something in the manufacturing process, and suddenly your manufacturing process has all of these new failure modes that are not currently captured by your risk management program. And so you would have to integrate those into your risk management, either in your process FMEA, your design FMEA, and capture that you've assessed those failure modes and whether or not the introduction of those failure modes outweigh the benefits of the correction that you're putting in place to address the nonconformance. Remember, conceptually, risk management is a balancing act. No medical device is without its potential to have failure modes occur. But part of your risk management process, as early as the design stages, is to demonstrate that the overarching benefits of having this medical device in the field outweigh the potential of these failure modes. And so that would be another way that you would use that type of a justification to say, our solution is not a perfect solution, but it is far outweighed, the benefits far outweigh the downsides. Now, again, you need very solid data-driven rationales for that. And in many cases, you might need a clinical assessment by a physician, which would likely come from our customer, to decide that these negative ramifications of the corrective actions still outweigh, from a clinical sense, the benefits. So I talked about design inputs, I talked about validations, I talked about risk management, clinical assessment. I would say that from a regulatory standpoint, the way that you demonstrate that you still meet regulatory requirements is that a lot of the regulatory bodies have guidance that says, depending on the nature of the change, if you have, and I'm going to call you, let me see if I've got it highlighted here. I'm going to call your attention specifically to safety and performance of the medical device. That's some kind of unique language there, because in the regulatory world, safety and performance links to efficacy and links to essential requirements. And in the regulatory world, there's a lot of documentation and submissions that go into demonstrating essential requirements and safety and performance of a medical device. And so if your corrective actions that you implement would change some of the technical documentation that you would have submitted in order to demonstrate those things, then you likely are going to have to resubmit or submit an update or a notification to those regulatory agencies and let them know of the corrective actions that you've implemented and how it impacts all of the things that I just described, how it impacts design, how it impacts your validated state, your risk management, the clinical efficacy. And so you need to update your documentation and files with the regulatory agencies in order to show that your corrective actions continue to meet the regulatory requirements as well. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
And
Thank you,
as you
Brian.
think about the specific example you have in mind, do you see how that connects to your specific
Yes.
example? Or okay.
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question.
So Brian, can I also offer up something as well as part of not even just a CAPA process, but as part of your change management process? So when you're implementing those changes as part of your change management process, there should be some sort of assessment. Like you talked about, the design file, the regulatory filings, those types of things should also be incorporated in your change management that can feed back into your CAPA.
Absolutely.
Yes, Michelle, thanks. Yeah, we do have that impact assessment section where we put down some justification. So yeah, we do have that. Thanks.
Good. Very good. Anybody else? Okay. That concludes section 8, and that concludes our review of the ISO standard 1345 in general. Hopefully everybody has found this series helpful. If you're not aware All of these sessions were recorded. They are all available on the Teams channel. If you can't find the links to the various sections, let me know and I'll figure out a way to get them published so that everybody has access. But if you did miss any of the sections, they are all recorded and available for you. And if you come across anything in the standard that you have questions about, as always, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Yeah.